Yes, my name is Jane Langley. I'm a psychodynamic psychotherapist and the director of two counselling and psychotherapy centres in Colchester and Ipswich in the southeast of England. I have a particular interest in the only child and the idea that as they have not experienced the arrival of actual siblings or the sudden awareness of the presence of older siblings, that they may not be able to negotiate and find a position for themselves within the sibling group. Therefore, my research question is, do only child adults enact a fantasy sibling group in which to find their position within the therapeutic setting? And can this be seen in the transference, which I suggest is a fantasy sibling transference, in which the therapist and the therapist's other patients are drawn into the drama? So I'm currently undertaking doctoral research into this phenomenon to see if it can be identified within the transference through the interviewing of psychoanalytic and psychodynamic practitioners who are working with or who have worked with only child adult patients. And I have found some interesting themes already starting to emerge in the data, which I hope to share with you at the end of this presentation. Now, when I talk about the only child adult, I am referring to an individual who has no siblings, no step siblings, and no half siblings. So early literature around the only child has been marred with negativity, with them being portrayed as developing abnormally and being unable to deal with the demands of social life. Stanley Hall, an eminent American psychologist back in the early 20th century, even went as far as describing being an only child as a disease in itself. And some of the early studies around that time have been sociological and psychological in nature and have suggested only children are neurotic, self-centered, and unable to deal with the rigors of social life, with a high percentage of anxiety, overactivity, crying, and nail biting. And other studies have found them to be fearful and moody, non-competitive, and hypochondrial. Now, Jacob Arlo, who is one of the few psychoanalytic writers, studied his own and his supervisee's only child adult patients and found some interesting patterns. He found his only child patients had fantasies of having destroyed potential rivals in the womb. And this extends Melanie Klein's idea that while in the womb, all the potential siblings are devoured or injured. And there are various symptom formations relating to this. Now, Arlo said that this was a specific fantasy common to all his patients. And he found that some had claustral fantasies as well as claustrophobic symptoms, a fear of closed spaces, and the unconscious fear of being stuck in the womb and devoured by the unborn siblings. And he also noted that there was a fear of retaliation in his patients from these devoured siblings. And he suggested that the only child fears the siblings will come along and oust him from his uniquely favoured position with his parents. And one of Arlo's patients was a 33-year-old woman who suffered with severe phobias, claustrophobia and obsessional fears. And he saw a connection between several of her phobias and an underlying fear of retaliation from the devoured siblings. She had a fear of pregnancy and cancer, and he saw that the fetus and the cancer represented these unborn siblings that were coming back to retaliate for being destroyed. And Arlo found that in his only child adult patients, this fear of retaliation from unborn siblings could take many forms, ranging from a fear of insects in one of his patients to having a fear of small children, and the fear that they would turn into these savage animals and attack him. And another had an obsessive fear of dogs, and several of his patients would have dreams of being attacked by animals. But Arlo didn't discuss how these fantasies might manifest in the transference within the therapeutic setting. Now, when trying to understand the psyche of the only child adult, I think it's necessary to have a brief look at the literature relating to the effects of siblings on children, on their emotional and psychological development. And this is really important when we want to understand how the absence of siblings can potentially affect the development of the only child. There was very little literature on siblings prior to the 1980s, with Freud only making scattered references and tending to refer to jealousy and rivalry, which may have been something to do with his own difficult sibling experience. However, Melanie Klein suggested that all humans expect a sibling to arrive, and that if it doesn't arrive, the infant will imagine they have destroyed them and will feel overwhelmed with guilt. She also suggested that siblings allow the infant to come to terms with their own aggressiveness and their own destructive feelings. And we all know, with our own experience of siblings, we can become murderously angry with them. And the fact the sibling survives it and we are the best of friends the next day suggests that our own anger and aggressiveness is survivable. Whereas she suggested the only child believes that their aggression and destructiveness has actually killed off the unborn siblings, making them feel very frightened of their own anger and frightened of the retaliation from other children. From the 1980s onwards, there was a surge of psychoanalytic literature on siblings, suggesting that having a sibling was important for psychic development, but not essential. But British psychoanalyst Juliet Mitchell went as far as to say that having a sibling was crucial and necessary, and is expected by all humans, as it serves to provide the conditions required for the infant to find a position within the sibling group, which is reflected later in life with peers, and where we find our position in amongst our peer, both at work and in family life. And she suggested that even if the sibling does not arrive, the infant will still continue to expect it. But she didn't expand on this. But she did, however, propose a sibling theory, which is something that Freud didn't do. And that sibling theory, she suggested that where psychoanalysis has tended to always focus on the vertical axis of the parent-child, as we know, Freud's Oedipal complex, which is the relationship between the parents and the infant, is central to psychoanalytic theory. But she introduced another axis, which she described as the horizontal axis of the lateral relations, those who were beside rather than above, the siblings, and the significance of these lateral relations should not be underestimated. So Mitchell's sibling trauma theory suggests that the expectation that a sibling will arrive is a universal one, meaning that every human being expects a brother or sister, whether that be the actual arrival of a new baby or the sudden awareness of older siblings. Either will throw the infant into a state of non-existence and nowhere. Their prized and favoured place with the parents has been taken and they no longer have a place. And this trauma evokes a sense of annihilation anxiety. The infant has been replaced. And this sets in motion the law of the mother, which Mitchell describes as the loving bribes and punishments dished out to the infant, preventing that infant from murdering the new baby, which is the immediate reaction to having one's place taken. I will destroy the one who has destroyed me. And this introduction also introduces the process of seriality, which she describes as the idea that the infant is in a series, one of many, And the infant will now have to take its turn in the sibling group and find a new position among the siblings. And this is experienced through the games that siblings play together and the having to wait for mum's attention while she is dealing with a brother or sister. But how does the infant actually find their new position? What's the specific process that happens here? Well, whilst Mitchell is primarily concerned with this existential issue of annihilation anxiety and how the infant defends against this, Janine Vivonen, an American psychologist, is much more focused on the issue of identity. And she suggests that the psychological manifestation of position is a way to know where you are in relation to someone else. And we can and do position ourselves with respect to others, with and through our identities. And she asks the questions: who does my position among my siblings allow me to be? What is the shape of my place in the family and in the world? And what is the value of my place? If identity is the psychological manifestation of position, then identity is marked by the sibling trauma and the child's attempts to resolve this trauma, which is to regain a unique position and valued place both with the parents and within the sibling group, and later in the world of peers. And Vivona suggests that siblings will invite the new baby into a position which is available. I am the smart one, so you can be the funny one. However, this process involves the infant being recognised by the siblings, which confirms its existence and its position on the lateral level. And this idea of recognition is taken up by Jessica Benjamin in her theory of intersubjectivity and mutual recognition. And in her subjectivity theory, Benjamin suggests that the necessity of recognising and being recognised by the other, I am the doer that does, I am the author of my acts. So recognition is the essential response, the constant companion of assertion. We have a need to recognise the other as a separate person who is like us and yet distinct from us. And the presence of the sibling forces a confrontation with the subjectivity of the other, which is the new baby or the older sibling. So we have a need for recognition by someone who is the same as us, but different. So a separate other, someone who is the same as us on the lateral level, but is also distinct from us, a separate being. And Vivona suggests that only siblings can provide this for each other. So the underlying need in these theories of intersubjectivity is this crucial need for mutual recognition, which is actually a very different need from the recognition from parents. Recognition from parents is extremely important, but that is on the vertical level and not on the lateral level. So the necessity, oh, hang on. Sorry, next slide. So if Mitchell and Klein suggest the arrival of the sibling is a universal expectation and the only child does not experience this arrival, what might the implications be? Well, several authors have discussed the idea of the sibling transference, which refers to actual siblings who have been internalised and projected onto the therapist and the therapist's other patients, reenacting the patient's early position within the sibling group. And Betty Joseph, in her well-known paper on transference, suggests that everything of importance in the patient's psyche, based on his early and habitual ways of functioning, his fantasies, impulses, defences and conflicts, will be lived out in some way in the transference. Therefore, the transference can reveal, through the counter-transference of the therapist, fantasy sibling relations which have not actually existed in the early life of the patient. And I suggest this is related to the unresolved dilemma of the sibling trauma, which is expected and necessary for the infant to resolve in order to transition him from the baby and into the social world of the child, among others who are the same, preparing for the entry into the adult world of peers and partners. And if this doesn't happen, and the expected sibling does not arrive, and there are no older siblings, the only child may continue to expect, to dread, and to even search for the sibling to enable the playing out of this necessary part of psychic development. And in my own clinical work with only child adult patients, I have been aware in my counter-transference a feeling of being competed with for what I have, or who I am, or perhaps my place or position in the world, which has evoked in me a fear of losing something significant. I've also had feelings of being admired by my only child adult patients and emulated, leaving me feeling a sense of superiority and grandeur. I've also had patients who have found it particularly difficult to sit in the waiting room with their fantasy siblings, as well as patients who have had extreme reactions to seeing others come out of my consulting room, who they have fantasized were my other patients and perhaps potential rivals for their place with me. And this at times has resulted in them bringing dreams to their therapy with themes of exclusion and of being placed on the outside of various situations and events, which has felt unbearable for them. And this suggests to me there is a fantasy sibling transference where the expectation, the dread, and the search is activated in the therapeutic setting. And I suspect in other settings as well. But it is a therapeutic setting where we can pick it up in the counter-transference of the therapist and where we can explore this unique phenomenon. So my research so far has started to reveal some really interesting patterns and themes, which I would like to briefly share with you, which I think indicates the presence of this fantasy sibling transference. But firstly, my methodology for this research project is a qualitative approach using semi-structured interviews of practitioners, that is counsellors and psychotherapists who are psychodynamic and psychoanalytic, working with only child adult patients within a therapeutic context. The study seeks to capture their experience of their work with these patients and how they have made sense of the transference within the therapeutic setting, using their understanding of their counter-transference, as well as my own counter-transference during my discussions with them. They are all practitioners working in private practice within an agency setting, using a waiting room, as this may allow for the manifestation of fantasies around the therapist's other patients to emerge, although this is not always essential. They can emerge without this. And the analysis of the data is through reflexive thematic analysis as developed by Virginia Braun and Victoria Clark. So I've undertaken all the interviews of these therapists and have already started to analyse the data, and some interesting themes have already started to emerge. All these patients, except one, has either the first appointment of the day or the very last. And I'm wondering about this as a need to be seen, a need for a place. So unconsciously, perhaps having a position at the beginning or at the end of the day, maybe coming from a fear of being replaced by the other fantasy siblings. A large number of the therapists I've interviewed have reported to feeling a competitiveness with these patients, not necessarily in themselves, but from the patient. And those therapists with siblings can relate it to a sibling-like feeling, although it doesn't always fit with their own sibling experience. It seems to have more of a fit if the therapists themselves are an older sibling, which is interesting because there are only two only child therapists who also feel this intensely and can relate it to this feeling, to what they imagine it would feel like being an older sibling in the transference. So this suggests that there is something happening. There is some kind of sibling experience going on within these only child adult patients. There also seems to be a lack of playfulness, a serious attitude to life in these patients, perhaps the absence of playing out different roles with siblings early in life through games, and the survival of siblings from these murderous attacks and aggressiveness. And also the only child therapists that I've interviewed sense a huge longing for something, a connection on a level that they haven't experienced before with their patients. And 3 of the other therapists who do have siblings themselves have also picked up this in their counter-transference, but have put it down to other issues with parents. And I wonder if this longing, this deep connection that these only child adult patients are searching for is something about the search for a sibling. And more than half of the therapists interviewed have felt intimidated, which I wonder about the patient's fear of being replaced, and so perhaps a need to assert themselves to ward off any potential rivals. And that assertion in the therapeutic encounter may well be experienced by the therapist as quite intimidating. And more than half of the therapists interviewed have experienced a difficult encounter with another patient or other person to whom the patient has reacted strongly with feelings of anger, betrayal, and anxiety. Again, I suggest this could be related to the only child adult's fear of being displaced by the fantasy sibling, and seeing the other person coming out of the therapy room perhaps evokes this overwhelming fear of potentially being thrown into a state of non-existence, and so is defending against that. And all the patients except one, so all the only child patients except one of them, has a job where there is a kind of separation from others. So an isolated manager, one is self-employed and who has contacts with others but is outside the main group. One is a professional working with other professionals of the same training but struggles to be part of the professional group and only associates with the admin staff. Perhaps these are all suggesting a difficulty in knowing where their position is in their group of peers. In fact, all of them have experienced difficulties with groups and feeling on the outside of groups. And this has been with peer relationships, which again, I suggest is about feeling that they don't hold a position in the group because they've never experienced or resolved the sibling trauma where they can find their position in a group. So the research continues, and I hope to find yet more patterns and themes of significance. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for talking today and addressing our audience, Ms. Langley. It was a great talk. I request audience, if anybody should have any questions, you can go ahead or you can type it in the chat box. And if we should have any questions, we will read the same to you, Ms. Langley. Could you please leave your contact information in the chat box?
I can indeed. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much. Let us have a round of applause for Ms. Langley.
Thank you. Thank you.
So much for the great talk. Next